I'll use the computer to help me write a high-quality Part 1 that follows your outline and style requirements. Now I'll review the draft to ensure it follows your requirements and make any necessary edits before posting the final version of Part 1. The doorbell rang at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning. 3 sharp, impatient rings that cut through the silence of Margaret Evans' house like a knife. She already knew who it was before she even reached the door. Her son Daniel never showed up unannounced unless he needed something. Margaret left her half-finished cup of tea on the counter and walked slowly down the hallway. Through the front windows, she could see his car, a shiny black SUV, parked crookedly in the driveway. Typical Daniel, always in a hurry, always careless with everything, including people. When she opened the door, he was already on his phone, thumb flying across the screen. In his other hand, a brown envelope. He gave her a quick air kiss, not even touching her cheek, and brushed past her into the kitchen like he still lived here. "Morning, Mom. We need to talk," he muttered, pulling out a chair and sitting down her chair, the one by the window where she usually read the paper. "Coffee would be great," he added without looking up. Margaret made it automatically. 10 years a widow, and she still served the men in her life as if it were her duty. When she placed the mug in front of him, she couldn't help noticing how tense his hands looked, how white his knuckles were as he scrolled. "Is Sophie okay?" "And the kids?" she asked, gently. She hadn't seen her grandchildren in months. "They're fine," Daniel muttered, finally putting his phone away. He took a sip of coffee and sighed. "I'll get right to the point, Mom." Sophie got herself into a bit of a situation. A familiar chill ran down Margaret's spine. "What kind of situation?" He pushed the envelope toward her. "She made some investments. They didn't pan out." Margaret opened it carefully. Inside were pages of bank statements, loan notices, and a contract with a number circled in red. $300,000. Her breath caught. "Daniel," I whispered. "That's almost everything I have." He leaned back in his chair, completely calm. "Mom, you live alone. The house is paid off. You've got your pension, your savings. You're 68. What are you saving for?" His tone was light, almost reasonable, but the words cut deep. "This house is my security," she said softly, "and I still have medical bills." "Mom, please," he interrupted, tapping the table impatiently. "Sophie just trusted the wrong person. If we don't pay this off today, things could get ugly." Margaret frowned. "Ugly how? They're not bankers, Mom," he said flatly. "They're dangerous people." A tremor of fear went through her. "What have you gotten involved in, Daniel?" "You don't need to know," he snapped. "Just trust me. I'll pay you back once the business stabilizes. I just need you to transfer the money now before it's too late." He sounded so much like his father in that moment, Edward, her late husband. Smooth, commanding, leaving no room for her opinion. She stared at the envelope, then at her son's face, the boy who once brought her wildflowers and called her his hero. Now he was a stranger in her kitchen demanding her life savings. "You've borrowed money from me before," she said quietly. "I never saw any of it again." His face hardened. "This is different. This is life or death, Mom. I'm your only son, your family. You always said you'd do anything for me. That line, 'you'd do anything for me.' It used to be her weakness, the same one Edward had used to keep her small and obedient for 30 years. Margaret looked down at her hands. They were trembling slightly. "I need to think about it," she whispered. "There's no time to think." Daniel's voice rose. "I need that money in my account before the end of the day. Tomorrow will be too late." He stood up, pacing like a trapped animal. Then he stopped behind her chair, placing his hands on her shoulders. His grip was firm, heavy, almost possessive. "Mom," he said softer now, "you know I wouldn't ask if it weren't serious. It's for Sophie's safety. For the family. Family. That word again. The word that had always chained her." Margaret closed her eyes and nodded weakly. "Okay," she said at last. "I'll transfer it." Relief washed over his face. For the first time that morning, he smiled that same charming smile that used to melt her heart when he was a boy. "Thanks, Mom. I knew I could count on you." He kissed her forehead, grabbed his phone, and headed toward the door. "I've got a meeting, but I'll be back for dinner." "Okay, we'll sort everything out then." He paused at the door and looked back. "Don't disappoint me, Mom." And then he was gone. The house fell silent except for the ticking of the kitchen clock. His half-empty cup of coffee sat in front of her, a dark, bitter reminder of what had just happened. She stared at it for a long time. Then something in her began to shift slowly at first, but unmistakably. A voice inside her whispered words she had never dared to think before enough. Through the window, she watched Daniel's car speed down the road, throwing gravel behind it. That's when the idea first formed in her mind, an idea the old Margaret would never have considered. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Marissa," she said when she answered. "It's Margaret. I need your help." Marissa arrived half an hour later. They'd been friends since college before Margaret dropped out to marry Edward. She'd always been the strong one, the practical one. A lawyer independent, everything Margaret wasn't. When Margaret told her what Daniel had done, she nearly dropped her tea. $300,000 to Margaret, that's insane. It's not the first time Margaret admitted her voice breaking. Last year it was $100,000. Before that, $50,000. He always promises to repay me, but he never does. Marissa slammed her cup down. "And why do you keep giving in? You're one of the smartest women I know. How can you not see what he's doing?" Margaret didn't have an answer, just a whisper. "He's my son, and you're his mother, not his bank," Marissa snapped. "Edward manipulated you for decades, and now Daniel's doing the same thing. When does it stop, Margaret?" Margaret looked out at her garden. The roses were blooming again after years of failing in bad soil. They had survived neglect storms and cold, just like her. "Today," she said suddenly. "It stops today." Marissa stared at her, then smiled. Finally. They spent the next hour planning quietly. Marissa would help her open a new account one Daniel didn't know existed and transfer her funds there. Then Margaret would pack her bags and leave before he came back for dinner. It sounded outrageous impossible. But as she listened to her own voice explaining the plan, Margaret realized how calm she felt. Fearful, yes, but also free. When she opened her closet later that afternoon, Margaret stared at her clothes, her memories, her life neatly folded on those shelves. She didn't want to take much, just essentials. Her medication, important papers, and a few keepsakes that still meant something to her. At the bottom of her dresser, she found a small wooden box, her secret stash. Just a few $1,000s she had saved over the years from selling baked goods and handmade scarves. Her tiny rebellion. She slipped it into her bag and took one last look at the house that had been both a home and a cage. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for anyone's approval. By the time the sun began to set, Margaret was ready, and for the first time in her life, she was the one about to disappear. At the bank, the manager looked puzzled when she told him she wanted to transfer every cent from her account. "Mrs. Evans," he said cautiously, "that's a considerable amount. Are you sure you want to move all of it?" "Yes," she said firmly, surprising even herself. "And I don't want any statements mailed to my address. Everything must stay digital." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and began the paperwork. As she signed each page, Margaret could almost feel the weight lifting off her shoulders. Each signature was a small act of rebellion, a quiet declaration of freedom. When they walked out of the bank, the Florida sun hit her face. It felt warmer than usual, almost forgiving. Marissa slipped her sunglasses on and gave Margaret a look of approval. "Well," she said, "you just took the first real step of your new life." Margaret laughed softly, though her voice trembled. "It feels terrifying." "It's supposed to," Marissa responded. "Freedom always feels like fear at first." They stopped by Marissa's law office next. She arranged everything quickly, power of attorney legal protections documents that would make it nearly impossible for Daniel to reverse what Margaret had done. Watching her work reminded Margaret of who Marissa was back in college. Confident, sharp, never apologizing for her strength. At one point, she looked up from her laptop and smiled gently. "You know, Margaret, I've waited decades to see this version of you." Margaret smiled back, though tears welled in her eyes. Better late than never. When the documents were signed and sealed, Marissa grabbed her car keys. "Now," she said, "let's get you out of that house." Back home, the afternoon light was fading, painting the kitchen golden. The same kitchen where Daniel had sat that morning cold and demanding now felt like a ghost of itself. Margaret opened the drawer and pulled out a piece of stationery. Her hand trembled as she began to write. "Daniel, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. You said not to disappoint you, but I think you'll find that I finally have. I'm disappointed, too. Disappointed in how easily I allowed myself to be used, to be diminished, to be afraid. This money you wanted isn't yours. It's what's left of my life, and I'm taking it with me. Don't look for me. Don't call. Maybe one day you'll understand that love isn't about control or obligation. It's about respect. And that's something I've finally learned to give myself. Mom, she folded the note carefully and slid it into a white envelope. On the front, she wrote his name in large, steady letters. Daniel. Marissa stood quietly behind her. You ready? Margaret looked around one last time at the photos on the walls, the clock ticking softly, the faint smell of roses from the garden outside. I'm ready. They packed quickly, just one suitcase and a few essentials. Marissa had already booked a flight to Miami for later that afternoon, where she owned a small beach apartment. Margaret left her wedding ring on the nightstand next to Edward's framed photograph. His cold, smiling eyes seemed to watch her as she turned off the light. By the time they drove away, the sun was sinking behind the trees. Margaret didn't look back. She didn't want to. The highway stretched out in front of them, endless and open. For years, she had dreamed of escaping of driving without knowing where she was headed. Now it was happening. As the city disappeared behind them, Marissa glanced at her. You okay, Margaret exhaled slowly. I don't know yet, but I feel alive. Marissa smiled. That's a start. At the airport, everything moved in a blur, check-in security, the rush of people around them. Margaret kept expecting Daniel to appear to grab her arm and demand explanations, but he didn't. They boarded the plane just as the sky turned orange and purple. As it lifted off the runway, Margaret looked down through the window and whispered a silent goodbye to the life she'd left behind. Marissa squeezed her hand gently. You just did something most people never find the courage to do. Margaret didn't answer. She just watched the clouds drift by, feeling the tears slide silently down her cheeks. Marissa's apartment in Miami was small but beautiful, a cozy space overlooking the ocean, filled with warm light and the scent of sea salt. That first night, Margaret sat on the balcony, a blanket around her shoulders, listening to the waves crash against the shore. It was the first time in years she could breathe freely. When she finally turned on her phone, she saw 17 missed calls, all from Daniel. She turned it off again. He'll find you eventually, Marissa said, handing her a glass of wine. But by then you'll be ready, maybe Margaret murmured. For now, I just want peace. The following days passed in a strange calm. She slept more than she had in months. She woke up early to watch the sunrise over the water. Marissa went back to work, but she called several times a day to check in. Still, Margaret's thoughts often drifted back to Daniel, wondering what he'd done when he found the letter. She could almost picture it. The disbelief, the anger, the shock of realizing he'd finally lost control. One afternoon, her phone rang again. This time, it was Marissa. You're not going to believe what just happened, she said, her tone half amused, half exasperated. Daniel showed up at my office, demanding to know where you were. He was furious, threatened to sue me. Margaret's stomach tightened. What did you tell him? I told him you were of sound mind and that if he didn't leave immediately, I'd file for a restraining order. I could hear Marissa smile through the phone. He turned red as a beet. I don't think anyone's ever stood up to him before. Despite everything, Margaret found herself laughing. You've always been my guardian angel. Not an angel, Marissa said softly. Just a friend who refuses to let you keep sacrificing yourself. By the end of the week, Margaret started to build small routines. She found a local market that sold fresh fruit and flowers. She baked again, something she hadn't done since Edward's death. The simple smell of bread and sugar filled the apartment, reminding her of a version of herself she'd almost forgotten. At 68, Margaret was learning how to live for the first time. But the peace didn't last long. A week later, a thick envelope arrived at Marissa's office, addressed to Margaret. Inside was a letter from Daniel's lawyer demanding her return to ensure her safety and mental well-being. It also threatened to have her declared incompetent if she didn't comply. Tucked inside the legal papers was a handwritten note from Sophie, her daughter-in-law. Margaret, please come back. Daniel is out of control. The creditors are calling. We need you. Margaret read the note 3 times. Her hands trembled, but not with fear, with anger. Marissa handled the legal side, swiftly sending back a statement that included Margaret's medical records, proof of financial stability, and detailed documentation of the loans Daniel had taken from her over the years. When she hung up the phone, she looked at Margaret calmly. They don't have a case, but he's not going to stop. Margaret nodded slowly. Then neither will I. That night, as the waves whispered outside the window, Margaret sat on the balcony again, staring at the endless horizon. Somewhere between the ocean and the stars, she felt the quiet pulse of a truth she'd ignored for too long. Daniel wasn't just Edward's son by blood. He was his father's echo, sharpened by privilege, spoiled by her love, and blinded by entitlement. But that chain, the one that bound mother to son, victim to manipulator, had finally broken. And this time she wasn't the one left in pieces. The morning the police knocked on her door, Margaret thought her heart might stop. It was too early for visitors. The sound was sharp, insistent, echoing through the small apartment like thunder rolling over calm water. For a brief, terrifying second, she thought it was Daniel. She could almost hear his angry voice, imagine the way his hand would slam against the door, his eyes filled with that cold, commanding fury. When she looked through the peephole, her knees nearly gave out from relief. It wasn't Daniel. It was a woman in plain clothes holding up a badge. "Mrs. Margaret Evans?" she asked when Margaret opened the door, keeping the security chain on. "Yes, that's me. Detective Olivia Price, Miami Police Department," she said gently. "May I come in? We need to talk about your son." Those last two words made Margaret's stomach twist. She let the detective in. The morning sunlight poured through the windows, making the room look warmer than Margaret felt. She offered coffee more out of habit than hospitality. Detective Price accepted with a polite smile, setting her small notepad on the table. "Mrs. Evans," she began carefully, "your son Daniel is being investigated for financial fraud, forgery, and possible ties to private lenders, some of whom have criminal backgrounds." Her words landed like stones. Margaret had always suspected Daniel's business dealings weren't entirely clean, but hearing it from a detective made it real. I had no idea," she stammered. "I knew he borrowed money. I knew he was struggling. But this?" Detective Price nodded. "We've reviewed several transactions in your name, Mrs. Evans. Did you ever sign any documents for him?" Margaret's throat tightened. "Years ago," she admitted. "He said it was for emergencies to protect me in case I needed help accessing funds. I trusted him." The detective sighed softly. "It appears those documents were used to open multiple accounts under your name. Large sums were transferred through them." Margaret felt dizzy. "You're saying he stole my identity?" The detective hesitated. "Technically, yes. You're a victim in this case, Mrs. Evans, but we'll need your statement." For a long moment, Margaret couldn't speak. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. Her son, the child she'd carried, raised, defended, had used her name not just for money, but for crime. "Will he go to prison?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "That depends on the evidence," Detective Price said softly. "But given the scope of what we've found, it's very likely." She gave Margaret her card and stood. "We'll keep you informed. In the meantime, Mrs. Evans, I recommend you stay cautious. Some of the people your son owes money to aren't safe to be around." When she left, Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the half-empty coffee mug the detective had left behind. The silence pressed on her chest like a weight. She'd spent 68 years of her life trying to protect her family. Now the only way to save herself was to let her son fall. Marissa arrived that afternoon as soon as she heard the news. "I told you," she said, pacing across the room. "He was going to drag you down with him." Margaret rubbed her temples. "He's still my son, Marissa, and that's what he's counting on," she replied. "You have to let the police handle this, Margaret. Promise me you won't call him." "I haven't," Margaret said truthfully. "And I won't." But that night she couldn't sleep. The waves crashed against the shore outside her window, rhythmic and relentless, like the beating of a guilty heart. Was it her fault? Had she loved him too much or not enough? At some point she got up, walked to the balcony, and looked out at the endless dark sea. Somewhere out there was the version of her that had never learned to say no. She whispered to her softly, "It's over." 3 days later, Margaret received a voicemail from Sophie. Her voice shook. "Margaret, please call me back. Daniel's been arrested. They took him in yesterday for questioning. I don't know what to do. The kids are scared. Please help us." She replayed the message twice, tears welling in her eyes. Then she deleted it. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. When she told Marissa, she nodded approvingly. "You did the right thing. Sophie will have to figure this out herself, Margaret. You can't save everyone." But her words didn't stop the ache in Margaret's chest. A week passed before Detective Price called again. "Mrs. Evans Daniel's been released temporarily pending trial," she said. "But I need to warn you he's angry. He's blaming you for cooperating with us." Margaret's blood ran cold. "Does he know where I live?" "We've taken precautions," the detective assured her. "But if anything happens, you call me immediately." That night, Margaret double-checked every lock on her doors and windows. She moved the small lamp from the bedside table to the living room so she could keep the lights on. She even kept a heavy vase near the door, ridiculous as that seemed. She didn't sleep at all. 2 days later, as she was returning from the market, she noticed a car parked near the building. It wasn't familiar. The windows were tinted too darkly for her to see inside. She tried to ignore it, telling herself she was being paranoid. But when she came back out an hour later, the car was still there. She called Detective Price. It's probably nothing she said, trying to sound calm. The detective didn't sound convinced. "Stay inside, Mrs. Evans. I'll send a patrol." 20 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up. The suspicious car drove off before they even got out. The next morning, Margaret found a note slipped under her door. "You shouldn't have crossed family, Mom." Her hands shook as she read it. The handwriting was Daniel's. Marissa was at her apartment within the hour. "He's completely lost it," she said after reading the note. "We need to increase your security. I'll handle it." Within a day, cameras were installed around the building. 2 off-duty officers were hired to patrol the area at night. Still, Margaret jumped at every sound, every creak, every passing shadow. She was living in paradise, with the constant fear of hell knocking on her door. A week later, there was another knock. Her heart nearly stopped again, but it wasn't Daniel this time either. It was Detective Price holding a folder. "Mrs. Evans," she said, "we've taken your son into custody again, this time for attempted blackmail and conspiracy." Margaret blinked. She opened the folder. Inside were transcripts of recorded phone calls. "Daniel tried to hire someone to scare you. We intercepted it. Don't worry, you're safe now." Margaret sank into her chair, hands trembling. "He wanted to hurt me." "Not necessarily hurt," the detective said carefully, "but intimidate. To remind you he still has power." Margaret felt tears well up, but they weren't from fear. They were from something deeper. Grief. Grief for the boy who used to bring her flowers, for the little voice that once said, "I love you, Mommy," for the son who no longer existed. After the detective left, Margaret called Marissa. She came over immediately carrying a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. They sat in silence on the balcony, watching the ocean turn gold under the setting sun. "How do you feel?" Marissa asked softly. "Empty," Margaret said. "And guilty." "Don't," Marissa said firmly. "If you hadn't left, you'd be the one in prison. Or worse." Margaret looked at her eyes, wet with tears. "I keep thinking if I'd raised him differently." Marissa shook her head. "You can't keep taking the blame for everyone else's choices, Margaret. Daniel made his bed. Now he's lying in it." Her words settled deep inside Margaret like stones sinking to the ocean floor. The next morning, the newspaper headline made her hands tremble. "Businessman arrested for fraud and ties to criminal groups." Below the headline was a photograph of Daniel in handcuffs being led into a police car. For a long time, Margaret just stared at it. That was her son. The same boy whose first word had been, "Mama." The same boy she'd rocked to sleep through fevers and nightmares. And yet the man in that photo looked nothing like the child she remembered. She folded the paper and set it aside. When the phone rang, she already knew who it was. "Mrs. Evans," Detective Price said. "Your son is requesting to see you." "Why, he says he won't speak to anyone else." Marissa looked horrified when Margaret told her. "You're not going." "Yes, I am," Margaret said quietly. "I need to see him. I need to end this." The next day, she walked into the cold gray walls of the police station. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Her palms were sweating as they led her into a small room divided by glass. Then she saw him. Daniel sat on the other side in an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed, eyes hollow. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. He looked older, smaller, like the little boy who used to run to her after school. But that illusion vanished as soon as he spoke. "Mom," he said hoarsely. "You came." Margaret nodded, sitting down. "You wanted to see me. I'm here." He leaned forward. "You have to help me. These people, they'll destroy me. I just need some money." "No." He froze. What Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I'm not giving you another cent. Not a penny. Not ever again." His face hardened. "You'd let your own son rot in jail. I'd let my son face the consequences of his actions." For a second, he said nothing. Then he slammed his handcuffed hands against the glass, making her flinch. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Margaret stood up slowly, her heart pounding, but her voice calm. "No, Daniel," she said quietly. "For the first time in my life, I won't." And she walked away, leaving behind not just her son, but decades of guilt, manipulation, and fear. As she stepped outside, the Miami sun hit her face again, warm, bright, and free. And for the first time in 68 years, Margaret felt like she finally belonged to herself. I'll use the computer to help me draft part 2 following your outline and requirements. The morning after her visit to the police station, Margaret woke to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. For a moment, she felt weightless, suspended between her old life and whatever came next. The prison's fluorescent lights had revealed something she'd been afraid to see: Daniel's true face, not the mask of the son she'd raised, but the stranger he'd become. She padded barefoot onto the balcony, feeling the cool tiles against her skin. Miami stretched before her, the morning sun transforming the ocean into a sheet of hammered gold. Below, early joggers dotted the shoreline, their feet leaving temporary impressions in the wet sand. How different from her old neighborhood, where neighbors watched from behind curtains and whispered about Edward Evans' quiet widow. The scent of coffee drifted from inside. Marissa appeared with 2 steaming mugs, her hair still damp from the shower, her expression gentle but concerned. "How did you sleep?" "After yesterday, I worried." Margaret accepted the coffee, warming her hands around the ceramic. "Better than I have in years, actually." And she had. The weight that had pressed against her chest for decades, the burden of keeping Edward happy, then keeping Daniel out of trouble, had lifted. In its place was a different pressure, the possibility of a life entirely her own. The thought terrified her almost as much as it exhilarated her. Marissa leaned against the railing. "I've been thinking, if you're going to stay in Miami, and I hope you do, you should have your own place." Margaret looked up, startled. "I couldn't impose on you indefinitely." Marissa waved away her concern. "Not what I meant. I mean, you should find something that's truly yours. Something Edward never touched, something Daniel can't claim. A fresh start. A fresh start." The words hung in the air like a promise. At 68, most people were winding down, not beginning again. But maybe that's what made it so precious, the unexpected gift of time she'd never imagined having. "I'd need a job," Margaret realized, surprising herself. All these years she'd lived off Edward's pension and investments. But if she truly wanted independence, she'd need her own income, her own purpose. Marissa smiled. "One step at a time. First, let's focus on getting you settled. I have a friend in real estate who specializes in affordable senior housing. Nothing fancy, but clean, safe buildings with good security." The mention of security brought yesterday's realities crashing back. Daniel's threats. The car with tinted windows. The note under her door. Marissa must have seen the change in her expression. "He can't hurt you anymore, Margaret. The restraining order is in place, and the prosecutor is building a solid case. Daniel will be in prison for years. But what if 10 years isn't enough?" Margaret's hand trembled slightly, coffee rippling in her mug. "What if he gets out and comes looking for me again?" Marissa's eyes hardened, the lawyer in her surfacing. "Then we'll be ready. But right now, the best revenge is living well, building a life he can't touch." Margaret nodded, though doubt lingered. She glanced at her watch, nearly 9, and there was something that needed doing, a call she'd been putting off. "I should check on Sophie and the kids," she said. "They must be devastated." Marissa hesitated. "You sure that's why Sophie's still married to Daniel? Anything you tell her could get back to him." Margaret stared out at the horizon. "Sophie may be his wife, but she's still the mother of my grandchildren. I need to know they're okay." She dialed with trembling fingers, half expecting to reach voicemail. Instead, Sophie answered on the second ring, her voice raw from crying. "Margaret." "Oh, thank God." The sound of her daughter-in-law's distress twisted something in Margaret's chest. "Sophie, how are you holding up?" A harsh laugh crackled through the phone. "They've frozen all our accounts. The credit cards are maxed out. I'm staying with my sister in Tampa with the kids, but—" The words hung there heavy with implication. Margaret closed her eyes. "How much do you need?" Marissa shot her a warning look, mouthing "careful." But Margaret held up a hand. This wasn't about Daniel. It was about Ethan and Marianne, innocent children caught in their father's mess. Sophie's voice broke. 2,000 would get us through the month. I'm looking for work, but with Daniel's arrest, everyone in town knows. No one's eager to hire the wife of a fraudster." Margaret nodded, though Sophie couldn't see her. "I'll wire the money today. And Sophie, this isn't your fault." A sob echoed through the line. "I should have known. All those late-night calls, the strange men coming to the house. Daniel said it was business, but deep down—" Margaret recognized the sentiment, that sick feeling of willful blindness. How many times had she ignored Edward's unexplained absences, his sudden influxes of cash, his whispered phone calls? "We see what we need to see to survive," she said softly. "The hard part is learning to look with clear eyes." After hanging up, Margaret faced Marissa's disapproving expression. "You're enabling her," Marissa said flatly. "I'm helping my grandchildren," Margaret replied. "There's a difference." But her friend's concern wasn't entirely misplaced. The familiar tug of family obligation, the very thing that had kept her trapped for so many years, pulled at her again. She would help Sophie and the children, but this time with boundaries. No blank checks. No unlimited access to her life or her emotions. They spent the rest of the morning contacting Marissa's real estate friend, a cheerful woman named Elena, who promised to find Margaret something cozy but dignified within her budget. By afternoon, they had 3 apartments to view the following day, all within walking distance of the ocean. After lunch, Marissa returned to work, leaving Margaret alone with her thoughts. She wandered through the small apartment, touching objects, looking at photographs. Marissa's life was full professional achievements, travel souvenirs, pictures with friends and family. A life lived fully and on her own terms. Margaret's possessions, in contrast, fit into a single suitcase. She had brought almost nothing from her old life, just practical necessities and a few keepsakes. Even her wedding ring had been left behind on the nightstand, a small act of defiance that now felt enormously significant. That evening, as the sun began to set, Margaret's phone rang again. Detective Price, her voice professional but kind. "Mrs. Evans, we've uncovered some additional information I think you should be aware of." Margaret sat down, bracing herself. "What now? Your son had outstanding debts to several, shall we say, unofficial lenders. One in particular, Antonio Velez, seems quite eager to recover his money." The name meant nothing to Margaret. "Who is he?" "A loan shark with connections to organized crime. He's been operating in Florida for nearly a decade, targeting desperate business owners. The interest rates are astronomical, and his collection methods tend to be aggressive." Margaret's mouth went dry. The suspicious car, the threatening note. Is he behind those? We can't prove it, but it's likely. Mr. Velez typically sends warnings before escalating. The detective paused. "Mrs. Evans, I need to ask, did your son ever mention using your house as collateral for a loan?" The question hit her like a physical blow. "My house? No, never." Detective Price's silence spoke volumes. "We found paperwork in your son's possession, a deed transfer with what appears to be your signature. It would have given him authority to offer your home as security for the loan." "But I never signed anything like that," Margaret protested, her heart racing. "That would be forgery." "Yes, it would. Which is why we've added it to the charges against him." The detective's tone softened slightly. "Mrs. Evans, until this is resolved, I'd recommend not returning to your home. If Velez believes he has a claim on that property." The implication hung in the air. Margaret thought of her garden, her kitchen, the quiet sanctuary she'd built after Edward died. All potentially claimed by a criminal she'd never met, thanks to the son she'd trusted. "Thank you for the warning," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wasn't planning to go back anyway." After hanging up, Margaret sat motionless, absorbing this new betrayal. Not just money, but her home. The one thing that had been truly hers, that she'd worked to maintain and improve over the years. The roses she'd nursed back to health. The kitchen she'd painted herself, the reading nook where she'd finally discovered books Edward had deemed too intellectual for her. All potentially lost because of Daniel's desperation and greed. When Marissa returned from work, she found Margaret still sitting in the same spot, staring at nothing. One look at her face told the story. "What's happened?" Margaret recounted Detective Price's call in a flat, emotionless voice. When she finished, she looked up at her friend with dry eyes. "I have nothing left. Nothing that's truly mine." Marissa knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. "That's not true. You have yourself. You have your freedom. You have a future that belongs only to you." The words barely penetrated the fog of loss surrounding her. Margaret shook her head. "I'm 68 years old. Too old to start over completely." Marissa's grip tightened. "Bullshit." The unexpected profanity shocked Margaret into looking directly at her friend. "You are not too old." Marissa continued, her voice fierce. "You're not defined by what Edward took from you or what Daniel destroyed. You get to decide who you are now." Something in her intensity broke through Margaret's numbness. A spark of anger ignited not at Marissa, but at the situation at Edward at Daniel, at the years she'd spent diminishing herself to accommodate their egos and ambitions. She stood up abruptly. "You're right. This isn't the end. It's just a different beginning than I expected." Marissa's expression softened into a smile. "That's more like it." The next morning, they met Elena at the first apartment on their list, a small one-bedroom in a building primarily occupied by retirees. The security was good with a doorman and cameras in the hallways. The apartment itself was modest but clean, with a tiny balcony offering a distant view of the ocean. Margaret walked through the rooms trying to imagine herself living there. It was nothing like her house, smaller, plainer, with none of the character she'd cultivated over decades. But it was safe. Anonymous. A blank canvas. "How soon could I move in?" she asked. Elena looked surprised at her directness. "The current tenant leaves at the end of the month. So about 3 weeks I'll take it." Margaret said, her decision made. Something in the apartment's very simplicity appealed to her. No memories, no ghosts, just space to become whoever she chose to be now. The paperwork took less than an hour. By lunchtime, Margaret had signed a 6-month lease and made arrangements to purchase basic furniture. The financial reality was sobering her savings while substantial were not inexhaustible. She would need to budget carefully, especially if she intended to help Sophie and the children. That afternoon, while Marissa was at work, Margaret decided to explore the neighborhood around her new apartment. The area was quieter than the tourist-heavy beaches near Marissa's place, populated by a mix of retirees and young families. She found a small grocery store, a pharmacy, and a community center advertising senior activities, water aerobics craft classes, book clubs. Outside the community center, a bulletin board caught her eye. Among the flyers for yard sales and lost pets was a hand-lettered notice, "Senior Craft Fair Vendors Wanted." Margaret stopped reading the details. The community center hosted monthly craft fairs where local seniors could sell handmade goods, knitting, quilting, baked goods, jewelry. She thought of the scarves and table runners she'd made over the years, items Edward had dismissed as little hobbies, despite the money they occasionally brought in. She'd been good at it, not just the technical aspects, but the design, the color combinations, the delicate embroidery that made her pieces stand out. Margaret took out her phone and snapped a picture of the flyer. It was a small thing, perhaps insignificant in the face of everything she'd lost. But it was a possibility, a way to earn some extra money to meet people, to create something with her own hands that belonged only to her. Walking back to Marissa's apartment, Margaret felt a fragile tendril of hope unfurling inside her. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with practical difficulties and emotional landmines, but for the first time it was her path to choose. The fragile peace of that moment shattered 3 days later when Margaret received a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. About Daniel." Her first instinct was to delete it to protect the small sense of security she'd built. But curiosity and concern won out. "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "Rachel, Daniel's assistant." Margaret frowned. She'd met Rachel only once at a company Christmas party years ago, a sharp-eyed young woman who seemed to anticipate Daniel's needs before he voiced them. "I don't think we have anything to discuss." Another quick response. "You might change your mind when you hear what I know about Edward." Margaret's hand trembled so badly she nearly dropped the phone. Her late husband's name appearing out of nowhere, linked somehow to her son's current troubles. "What do you know about Edward?" Instead of texting back, Rachel called. Her voice was low, urgent. "Not over the phone. Can you meet me tomorrow, 2 p.m.? The coffee shop at Brickell Point." Margaret hesitated, suspicion warring with curiosity. "How do I know this isn't a trap?" Rachel's laugh was short, humorless. "Mrs. Evans, I'm risking my job, possibly my safety, by reaching out to you. I was Daniel's executive assistant for 5 years. I've seen things, done things I'm not proud of. But what's happening now goes beyond business. It's personal, and you deserve to know the truth." The line went silent for a moment. "Then bring someone with you if you're worried. Just come." After Rachel hung up, Margaret sat still, her mind racing. She should call Detective Price, report this strange contact. She should ignore it entirely, focus on moving forward rather than looking back. Instead, she called Marissa. It could be a setup her friend warned after hearing the story. Daniel trying to get to you through this woman? Or it could be genuine, Margaret countered. Rachel sounded scared. "And she mentioned Edward." Marissa sighed. "If you're determined to go, I'm coming with you. And we're meeting somewhere public with plenty of witnesses." They arrived at the coffee shop 20 minutes early the next day, securing a table near the front window where they could watch people entering. Margaret ordered tea. She couldn't taste her nerves, making her stomach clench. Beside her, Marissa kept one hand in her purse where Margaret suspected she kept something for self-defense. Rachel arrived exactly at 2, looking nothing like the polished professional Margaret remembered. Her hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she glanced over her shoulder twice before spotting them and hurrying over. "Thank you for coming," she said, sliding into the chair across from them. "I wasn't sure you would." Marissa leaned forward. "Before we go any further, I should tell you I'm a lawyer, and if this is some kind of attempt to intimidate or manipulate Mrs. Evans," Rachel cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I'm trying to help her." She turned to Margaret, her expression softening. "Mrs. Evans, I worked closely with your son for years. I knew his business practices were aggressive, but I didn't realize the extent of it until the police started investigating." Margaret nodded, waiting. Rachel lowered her voice. 2 days ago, I was cleaning out Daniel's office archiving files for the company. I found a safety deposit box key taped to the underside of his desk drawer with an address and box number. She reached into her purse and withdrew a small manila envelope, sliding it across the table. "When I opened the box, I found these. I think you should have them." Margaret took the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were several old photographs and a USB drive. The top photo showed Edward younger than when she'd married him, perhaps in his early 20s, standing beside another man on a boat. They were laughing arms around each other's shoulders, the water sparkling behind them. She turned the photo over. Someone had written Ed and Tony 1975 on the back in faded blue ink. "I don't understand," Margaret murmured. "Who's Tony?" Rachel glanced nervously at the door before answering. "Antonio Velez, the loan shark Daniel borrowed from." Margaret's world tilted. The man hunting her son, threatening her home, he knew Edward. But that's impossible. Edward died 10 years ago. This Velez person only came after Daniel recently. Rachel shook her head. "No, Mrs. Evans. Velez and your husband were associates for decades. The photos prove it, and the files on that drive confirm it. Your husband was laundering money for Velez's organization long before Daniel got involved." Marissa reached for the USB drive. "May I?" Rachel nodded. "I made copies. These are financial records going back almost 30 years. They show transfers between shell companies, investments in properties that were later sold at suspicious profits. Edward Evans was helping Velez clean illegal money and taking a cut." The coffee shop spun around, Margaret voices receding as though underwater. Edward, her controlling conventional husband, a criminal. It made no sense, yet it explained so much. His unexplained income, his secretive phone calls, his insistence that she remain ignorant of their finances. When she could speak again, she asked the question burning inside her. "Did Daniel know about his father's involvement with Velez?" Rachel hesitated. "Not at first, I don't think. But after your husband died, Velez approached Daniel. Said there was an outstanding debt that needed settling." The familiar pattern clicked into place in Margaret's mind. So Daniel started working with him just like Edward had. Rachel nodded. Except Daniel wasn't as careful as his father. He took bigger risks, borrowed more than he could repay. And when things started falling apart, he used your name, your property, as collateral. Marissa, who had been examining the photos, looked up sharply. "Why are you telling us this? Why take the risk?" Rachel's expression hardened. "Because Daniel set me up to take the fall if things went wrong. Made me sign documents I didn't understand, had me make calls that could be traced back to me, but not him. When the investigation started, he told me to delete files, shred papers, basically obstruct justice." She took a deep breath. "I refused. So he fired me and threatened to make sure I'd never work in finance again." Margaret studied the young woman's face, seeing the fear beneath her defiance. "You're testifying against him?" It was a statement, not a question, but Rachel nodded anyway. "The prosecutor offered me immunity. In exchange, I tell them everything I know about Daniel's operations. And about Velez." She glanced at her watch. "I should go. I've already stayed too long." "Wait," Margaret reached across the table, touching Rachel's hand. "Thank you. For the truth, for your courage." Rachel's eyes softened briefly. "Mrs. Evans, be careful. Velez isn't just after Daniel. The debt he claims goes back to your husband. In his mind, you owe him too. After she left, Margaret and Marissa sat in silence, the implications of Rachel's revelations settling around them like dust after an explosion. Everything Margaret had believed about her marriage, about Edward, about the foundation of her life, had been built on quicksand. When they returned to the apartment, Marissa immediately connected the USB drive to her laptop. The files were exactly as Rachel had described: spreadsheets, bank statements, property records. A paper trail of Edward's double life extending back almost to the beginning of their marriage. Margaret watched the evidence of her husband's deception scroll across the screen, a strange numbness replacing the initial shock. All those years of believing herself insignificant, incapable of understanding complex financial matters, as Edward had put it, while he had been involved in criminal activities that could have destroyed them both. "Do you think he ever intended to tell me?" she asked quietly. Marissa looked up from the computer, her expression gentle but honest. "No. Men like Edward and Daniel view the women in their lives as accessories, not partners. Keeping you ignorant wasn't just convenient. It was essential to maintaining control. The truth of it stung even after all this time." Margaret moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. The ocean was turning indigo, the first stars appearing above the horizon. "I should have known," she said softly. There were signs. The unexplained absences, the secretive phone calls, the way he'd changed the subject whenever I asked about money. Marissa joined her at the window. "You saw what he allowed you to see. What society trained you to accept from a husband. It wasn't your fault." But Margaret wasn't entirely convinced. Hadn't there been a kind of willful blindness on her part? A choice to accept the security Edward provided without questioning its source. "We need to take this to Detective Price," Marissa said, breaking into her thoughts. "These records could be crucial to the case against Daniel, and they might help protect you from Velez." Margaret nodded, the practical reality cutting through her emotional turmoil. If Velez believed she had inherited Edward's debt, he wouldn't stop coming after her regardless of what happened with Daniel. "We'll go first thing tomorrow," she agreed. "But tonight I just need to process all this." Later, alone in the guest bedroom, Margaret opened the envelope again, spreading the photographs across the comforter. Edward, as she'd never seen him, young, carefree in the company of criminals. In one photo, he stood beside a gleaming sports car looking triumphant. In another, he sat at a nightclub table, surrounded by glamorous women, none of them Margaret. The last photo hit her hardest. Edward holding infant Daniel, beaming with pride. The beginning of the cycle that would eventually consume them both. She put the photos away, unable to bear looking at them any longer. Then she reached for the notepad beside the bed and began to write, pouring out decades of unacknowledged truth. Hours passed as she filled page after page, exorcising the ghosts of her marriage, confronting her own complicity and remaining silent, examining the patterns that had led Daniel to follow in his father's footsteps. When she finally set the pen down, dawn was breaking over the ocean. Margaret felt emptied out, scoured clean by the torrent of words. The revelations about Edward were painful, but they also granted a strange kind of freedom. The man she had feared and obeyed for 30 years, whose ghost had continued to influence her choices even after his death had been a fraud. His moral authority, the standard against which she had always measured herself and found wanting, had been an illusion. Later that morning, bleary-eyed but resolved, Margaret and Marissa delivered Rachel's evidence to Detective Price. The detective's expression remained professional, but her eyebrows rose slightly as she examined the files. "This corroborates information we've been gathering from other sources," she admitted. "We suspected a historical connection between Velez and your husband, but couldn't prove it definitively." Margaret swallowed hard. "Does this change things with Daniel's case?" The detective considered. "It adds context, certainly. Shows a pattern of criminal association that extends beyond your son, but it doesn't exonerate him. If anything, it suggests his activities were more deliberate than we initially thought, continuing a family tradition, so to speak." She leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Evans, with this new evidence, we have greater cause for concern about your safety. Velez is not someone who forgives debts, even those decades old. Until we can apprehend him, I'd strongly recommend remaining at a location he can't connect to you." Margaret nodded, a chill settling in her bones, despite the warm Miami morning. "So I'm still a target?" "Potentially, yes. But we're closer to building a case against Velez himself, which is the best protection in the long run." As they left the police station, Marissa squeezed Margaret's hand. "You did the right thing bringing this forward." Margaret wasn't so sure. The revelations had protected no one, not Daniel, not herself. They had only confirmed that her entire life had been built on lies that the men she had trusted had used and betrayed her at every turn. "I need to see him," she said suddenly. "Daniel, I need to talk to him now that I know about Edward." Marissa looked alarmed. "That's not a good idea. He's angry, desperate. Whatever you're hoping to hear from him, I'm not hoping for anything," Margaret interrupted. "I just need to look him in the eye knowing what I know now. I need to understand how deep this goes." Despite Marissa's continued objections, Margaret arranged another visit to the detention center where Daniel was being held pending trial. The process was grimly familiar now, the security screening the stark visitation room, the uncomfortable plastic chair facing the glass partition. When Daniel was brought in, Margaret was struck again by how diminished he looked in custody. The confident businessman replaced by a wary, haunted version of her son. He seemed surprised to see her approaching the partition with hesitation. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Margaret studied his face, searching for traces of Edward, for signs of the same calculation and deceit she now recognized in her late husband. "I know about your father," she said without preamble. "About Velez. About the money laundering." Daniel paled, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the counter. "Who told you?" "Does it matter? It's true, isn't it? Your father was a criminal, and you followed in his footsteps." He glanced around nervously, lowering his voice. "You can't say things like that in here. These places are monitored." Margaret leaned forward. "I don't care anymore, Daniel. I've spent my entire life being careful, watching what I say, what I do, how I appear to others. I'm done with that. I want the truth." For a long moment he stared at her calculation, visibly warring with desperation in his eyes. Then his shoulders slumped slightly. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "Dad worked with Velez for years. Laundered money through his legitimate businesses. He was good at it, careful, methodical. He kept it completely separate from his home life." "You mean he lied to me," Margaret corrected, "for our entire marriage?" Daniel had the grace to look away. "He thought he was protecting you, keeping you and me safe by making sure you knew nothing." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "And when he died, Velez came to you." Daniel nodded. "Said Dad owed him for a deal gone bad. Threatened to come after you after the house if I didn't settle the debt. So I stepped in. Worked with him like Dad had." A subtle shift occurred in his expression, a flicker of the old arrogance returning. "I was good at it too. Better than Dad even. Until things went sideways." The casual admission stunned Margaret. He spoke of criminal activity, of continuation of his father's deception without a trace of remorse or shame. Just professional assessment of his own performance compared to Edward's. "So when you came to me for money when you demanded $300,000. It was for Velez," he confirmed. "Sophie's investments were a cover story. I needed cash quickly off the books. I thought you'd give it to me, no questions asked." Like always. The last two words cut deepest. Like always. The pattern of her life reduced to a simple expectation of compliance. Of surrender. Margaret stood up. "I have nothing more to say to you." "Wait," Daniel's voice took on an edge of desperation. "Mom, you don't understand. These people are serious. When I can't pay, they'll come after what they can get. The house. Maybe even you." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Let them try." As she turned to leave, Daniel called after her, his voice rising. "Mom, you can't just walk away from this. We're family." The word that had enslaved her for so long, that had justified every sacrifice, every erasure of self. She paused at the door, looking back one last time at the son who had become a stranger. "Family doesn't use each other, Daniel. Family doesn't lie and manipulate and steal. What we had wasn't family. It was a chain linking us to Edward's sins. I'm breaking it here and now." She left him there, his protests fading behind the heavy door of the visitation room. In the harsh sunlight outside the detention center, Margaret took a deep breath, feeling something final settle within her. The last illusions about her marriage, about her son, had been stripped away. What remained was a clarity both painful and necessary. Marissa was waiting in the car, concern etched on her face. "How did it go?" Margaret fastened her seatbelt, her movements deliberate. "Exactly as it needed to. I have my answers now. I know where I stand." "Where's that?" Margaret looked out at the Miami streets passing by at the city that had become her unexpected refuge. "On my own 2 feet," she said simply. "For the first time in my life, completely on my own. I'll use the computer to help me draft part 3 of this story, following your outline and requirements precisely." The morning sun streamed through the windows of Margaret's new apartment, catching dust motes that danced in the light. 6 months had passed since her confrontation with Daniel in the detention center. 6 months of building a life from scratch at an age when most people were settling into well-worn routines. She stood in the small kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil and surveyed her domain. The space was modest one-bedroom, a combined living and dining area, a narrow balcony just big enough for a chair and a few potted plants. But every object in it was hers alone, chosen with intention. No ghosts of Edward lingered in these rooms. No echoes of Daniel's demands hung in the air. The kettle clicked off. Margaret poured hot water over a tea bag, the familiar ritual grounding her in the present moment. On the counter lay a half-finished embroidery piece, an intricate pattern of ocean waves in shades of blue and green. Her first attempt at designing something to sell at the senior craft fair. The initial fair had been terrifying. Setting up her small table in the community center, arranging her handmade scarves and embroidered tea towels, wondering if anyone would stop to look much less by. But they had. 3 scarves and 5 towels sold that first Saturday, netting her just over $100. Not enough to live on, certainly, but a beginning. Proof that her work had value beyond what Edward and Daniel had allowed. Now, 3 months later, she had regular customers who sought out her table. The extra income supplemented her carefully budgeted savings, allowing small luxuries, fresh flowers, occasional dinners out with Marissa, art supplies for Ethan and Marianne when they visited. The thought of her grandchildren brought a smile to Margaret's face. They were coming today, staying for the weekend, while Sophie attended a job interview in Orlando. Their visits had become more frequent as the months passed, Sophie gradually loosening her grip on Daniel's version of events. The children brought noise and chaos to Margaret's quiet apartment, but also a joy she hadn't realized she was capable of feeling. Her phone chimed with a text from Sophie. On the road, should be there by noon. Margaret responded with a quick drive safely and went to make sure the pull-out sofa was ready for the children. The apartment wasn't large enough for proper guest accommodations, but Ethan and Marianne didn't mind. To them, sleeping in the living room was an adventure like camping indoors. As she straightened pillows and checked that she had enough snacks to satisfy 2 growing children, Margaret marveled at the unexpected turn her relationship with Sophie had taken. The financial help she'd offered in those early days had evolved into something more meaningful, a genuine friendship between 2 women who'd been manipulated by the same man in different ways. Their weekly phone calls had become a lifeline for both of them. Sophie struggling to rebuild her life as a single parent, Margaret offering the wisdom of hard-won experience. Neither blamed the other for Daniel's actions. They were survivors of the same storm, finding their way back to shore together. The doorbell rang at 12:15. Margaret opened it to find Sophie looking tired but determined, with Ethan bouncing excitedly beside her and Marianne clutching a small backpack to her chest. Grandma Ethan barreled forward, wrapping his arms around Margaret's waist. I lost another tooth, see? He grinned widely, displaying the gap where a front tooth had been. Margaret hugged him tightly, then bent to embrace Marianne, who approached more cautiously, but melted into her grandmother's arms. Sophie set down 2 small suitcases inside the door. Thanks again for taking them. This interview could be exactly what I need, full benefits, flexible hours. Margaret waved away her gratitude. Go. Focus on yourself for once. We'll be fine. After Sophie left, promising to call that evening, Margaret turned to the children. She'd planned a full weekend the beach that afternoon, a children's museum on Saturday, baking cookies on Sunday before their mother returned. Activities to keep small hands busy and worried minds occupied. Ethan, already exploring the apartment, spotted the embroidery on the counter. What's that? Margaret explained her work, showing him the delicate stitches that formed the pattern. To her surprise, he seemed genuinely interested, asking how she knew which colors to choose, how long it took to make something like this. Can you teach me? Marianne's soft voice broke in her eyes wide with curiosity. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. After the beach, if you'd like. I have some extra hoops and thread. The afternoon passed in a blur of sandy feet and salty hair, the children running along the shoreline, while Margaret watched from a beach chair. Ethan collected shells, rushing back every few minutes to show her his latest treasure. Marianne, more reserved, built an elaborate sand castle decorated with bits of seaweed and pebbles. Margaret observed them closely, searching for signs of trauma from their father's arrest and absence. Ethan seemed largely resilient, adapting to their new circumstances with childlike flexibility. Mary Ann was harder to read, quieter than before, sometimes staring into space with an expression too serious for her 6 years. Back at the apartment, showered and changed, they gathered around the small dining table. Margaret laid out embroidery hoops, colorful threads, and simple patterns. With infinite patience, she guided Mary Ann's small fingers, teaching her the basic stitches. Ethan, initially scoffing that embroidery was for girls, was soon engrossed in creating a lopsided star pattern, his tongue sticking out in concentration. "This is hard," he complained at one point, but didn't stop trying. The determination in his furrowed brow reminded Margaret painfully of Daniel as a child before Edward's influence had twisted his natural persistence into ruthless ambition. That evening, after tucking the children into the pull-out sofa, Margaret sat on her balcony with a glass of wine. The moon hung low over the ocean, casting a silver pathway across the water. She thought about how differently this night might have unfolded if she hadn't found the courage to leave, if she'd given Daniel the money he demanded, if she'd remained trapped in the cycle that had defined her existence for decades. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marissa. "How are the Munchkins surviving grandma duty?" Margaret smiled, typing back. "More than surviving. They've taken up embroidery. Even Ethan." Marissa's response came quickly. "Now that I'd pay to see. Still on for lunch Tuesday." Their friendship had deepened over the past months, evolving from Marissa's protective concern to a relationship of equals. They met weekly for lunch, occasionally took weekend trips to explore other parts of Florida, and spoke almost daily. Marissa had been the first person to insist that Margaret's embroidery was good enough to sell, had helped her set up at that first craft fair, had celebrated each small victory as Margaret rebuilt her life piece by piece. The next text wasn't from Marissa, however. It was from Detective Price. "Need to speak with you. New developments in your son's case. Can you come to the station tomorrow?" Margaret's stomach clenched. She'd heard little about Daniel's case in recent months, preferring to focus on her own healing rather than his legal troubles. But she couldn't ignore this. She texted back, "Have my grandchildren this weekend." Monday morning, the detective agreed, and Margaret tried to put the matter from her mind, determined not to let it overshadow her time with Ethan and Mary Ann. Whatever new complications had arisen in Daniel's case, they could wait. This weekend belonged to the future, not the past. Saturday at the Children's Museum proved a welcome distraction. Margaret watched Ethan race from exhibit to exhibit, his energy seemingly limitless. Mary Ann moved more deliberately, spending long periods at each display, asking thoughtful questions that sometimes stumped the museum guides. "They're so different," Margaret mused, yet equally precious. She wondered how she would have parented Daniel differently, knowing what she knew now. Would stricter boundaries have helped more independence, less indulgence, or had Edward's influence been the determining factor regardless of her efforts? That night after the children were asleep, she found Mary Ann's embroidery hoop on the coffee table. The little girl had created a simple flower, the stitches uneven but earnest. Beside it lay a note in careful printing. "For you, Grandma, love, Mary Ann." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Such a small thing, a child's first attempt at a new skill, a handmade gift. Yet it represented something profound, the possibility of breaking cycles of new patterns, emerging from old threads. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Sophie collected the children amid hugs and promises to visit again soon. Mary Ann clung to Margaret an extra moment, whispering, "I'll practice my stitches at home." After they left, Margaret changed into a simple navy dress and cardigan clothing that made her feel armored for whatever news awaited at the police station. She took a ride share rather than the bus, unwilling to risk being late. Detective Price met her in the same interview room where they'd spoken before, but something was different about the detective's demeanor, less formal, more cautious. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Evans. There have been significant developments in your son's case and in the larger investigation into Antonio Velez." Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. "What's happened?" The detective placed a folder on the table between them. 2 days ago, Daniel agreed to testify against Velez in exchange for a reduced sentence. A cold weight settled in Margaret's stomach. The son she knew would never voluntarily cooperate with authorities unless there was substantial benefit to himself. "And what have you offered him?" Detective Price met her gaze directly. If his testimony leads to Velez's conviction, Daniel's sentence would be reduced from 12 years to 5, with possibility of parole after 3. Margaret absorbed this. 3 years. Daniel could be free in 3 years, back in the world, potentially back in her life if he chose to pursue contact. The thought sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the room's air conditioning. "Why are you telling me this?" Surely this is standard procedure in cases like his. The detective's expression shifted slightly. That's not the only development, Mrs. Evans. Last night we arrested Antonio Velez based partly on information Daniel provided. During the arrest, we recovered documents from Velez's home safe. Documents that concern you directly. She slid several papers across the table. Margaret recognized the first immediately, a deed transfer for her house with what appeared to be her signature. Except she'd never signed such a document. As I suspected, this is a forgery, she said, pushing it back toward the detective. Yes. Detective Price nodded. Our forensic analysts confirmed that. But this one, she slid another document forward, this one bears an authentic signature. Your husband's. Margaret stared at the yellowed paper. It was dated 1992, nearly 30 years ago. A contract of sorts, with Edward's bold signature at the bottom. The language was dense with legal terminology, but the essence was clear. Edward had pledged Margaret's house, then newly purchased as collateral, for a substantial loan from Velez. That's impossible, Margaret whispered. We bought that house together. My name is on the mortgage. The detective nodded. Yes, but it appears your husband leveraged it without your knowledge. According to Velez's records, Edward never fully repaid that loan. When he died, Velez considered the debt transferable to Daniel and eventually to you. The room seemed to tilt slightly. All these years, Margaret had believed the house was the one thing truly hers, the one asset Edward couldn't touch from beyond the grave. But even that had been an illusion. So legally, does this criminal, have a claim on my home? Detective Price shook her head. No, the contract wouldn't hold up in court. It was never notarized, and more importantly, you never consented to it. But Velez doesn't operate through legal channels, Mrs. Evans. He believed he had a rightful claim, which is why he's been pursuing you. A new thought struck Margaret with paralyzing force. If Velez is in custody and Daniel provided the information that put him there. The detective nodded grimly, reading her mind. Velez has associates who remain at large. If they believe Daniel betrayed their boss. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Margaret understood the implication perfectly. Daniel had made himself a target. And by extension, possibly Margaret herself, and even Sophie and the children. What should I do? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. We're taking precautions. Detective Price's tone became briskly professional. Officers will patrol your neighborhood more frequently. We've arranged for a security consultation for your apartment building. And we strongly recommend you vary. Your routines remain alert to your surroundings and report anything unusual immediately. Margaret nodded, the practical advice anchoring her as her mind raced with implications. Is Sophie aware of the potential risk we've contacted her? She's taking appropriate measures for herself and the children. The detective hesitated, then added more gently, There's one more thing. Daniel has asked to see you. Margaret's head snapped up. Why? He wouldn't say specifically. Only that it was important, personal. You're under no obligation to agree, of course. Margaret stared at her hands now clasped tightly in her lap. The last time she'd seen Daniel, she'd walked away from him, symbolically severing the tie that had bound her to decades of manipulation and deception. She'd been rebuilding her life without him finding strength she'd never known she possessed. Did she want to reopen that door even slightly? Yet something in her, the mother she'd been, perhaps, or simply human curiosity, couldn't refuse outright. I'll think about it. The detective nodded, respecting her ambivalence. Take your time. He's not going anywhere. Outside the police station, Margaret stood on the sidewalk, momentarily paralyzed by indecision. She'd planned to visit the fabric store after the meeting, then have lunch alone at the small cafe she'd discovered near her apartment. Normal activities for her new normal life. But now that life felt threatened, the careful peace she'd constructed suddenly fragile. She pulled out her phone and called Marissa. Can you meet me? Something's happened. 30 minutes later, they sat in a quiet corner of Marissa's favorite restaurant, well away from other diners. Margaret recounted the meeting with Detective Price, watching her friend's expression shift from concern to alarm. So Daniel's turned informant, Marissa summarized her legal mind, extracting the key points. And now both of you could be at risk from Velez's associates. Margaret nodded, twisting her napkin in her lap. The irony is breathtaking, isn't it? I left to escape Daniel's choices, and now those same choices might follow me here. Marissa reached across the table, stilling Margaret's restless hands. Let's focus on what we know, not what might happen. The police are aware of the situation. They're taking precautions. You're safer knowing about the threat than you were ignorant of it. Her logical approach cut through Margaret's spiraling anxiety. You're right. Knowledge is power, isn't it? That's what Edward never wanted me to have. Exactly, Marissa smiled approvingly. Now what about Daniel's request to see you? What are you thinking? Margaret sighed, the question having circled her mind continuously since Detective Price mentioned it. I don't know. Part of me wants to refuse on principle. He's manipulated me so many times before. And the other part wonders if this might be different. He's facing real consequences now. Possibly additional danger because of his testimony. Perhaps. She trailed off, unwilling to voice the hope that still lived within her despite everything. Marissa finished the thought gently. Perhaps he's changed? Margaret nodded, embarrassed by her persistent maternal optimism in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Is that foolish of me? Not foolish. Human, Marissa's voice softened. You're allowed to hope, Margaret. Just don't let hope blind you to reality. For 3 days, Margaret deliberated. She went about her routines, teaching an embroidery class at the community center meeting with the small circle of friends she'd made through the craft fairs, working on new designs for her growing business. But beneath the surface normalcy, the question persisted. Should she see Daniel again? On the 4th day, she made her decision. She called Detective Price and arranged to visit the detention center the following afternoon. This time, the Stark visitation room felt different. Margaret sat straighter in the uncomfortable plastic chair, no longer diminished by shame or confusion. When Daniel appeared on the other side of the glass partition, she studied him objectively. He'd lost weight. His prison uniform hung loosely on his frame, and new lines etched his face. But the most striking change was in his eyes. The arrogance had dimmed, replaced by something more complex. Not quite humility, but perhaps its distant relation. Mom, he began, his voice raspier than she remembered. Thank you for coming. Margaret didn't smile. Detective Price said you wanted to see me. I'm here. What do you want? Daniel flinched slightly at her directness. I wanted to warn you about Velez's people. They don't forgive betrayal. The police already told me about the potential risk, she replied evenly. Is that all? He shifted uncomfortably. No, I also wanted to explain why I decided to testify. It wasn't just for the reduced sentence, though I won't pretend that wasn't a factor. Margaret weighted her expression neutral, neither encouraging nor discouraging his explanation. I've had a lot of time to think in here, he continued. About Dad, about the choices I made, about what I did to you, to Sophie, to my own kids. His voice cracked slightly on the mention of Ethan and Marianne. Margaret felt an unwilling twinge of empathy. The children asked about him occasionally, especially Ethan. She never knew quite what to tell them. I'm not claiming some dramatic jailhouse conversion, Daniel went on, but I've started to see things differently, to understand what Dad did to both of us. Margaret's eyebrows rose. Both of us. He nodded. Dad groomed me, Mom, from the time I was a kid. All those father-son fishing trips. He was introducing me to his contacts, teaching me how the system worked, how to manipulate people, how to justify anything in the name of protecting the family. He swallowed hard. I'm not excusing what I did, but I'm starting to understand how I became someone who could do those things. Margaret absorbed his words, searching for manipulation, but finding what seemed like genuine self-reflection. It was a perspective she hadn't considered fully, that Daniel too had been Edward's victim in a different way. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Because I don't want to be him anymore, Daniel replied, a new intensity in his voice. I don't want to leave the same legacy. For Sophie, for the kids, for you. Testifying against Velez is the first step toward breaking that pattern, toward some kind of redemption, I guess. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and uncertain. Margaret studied her son's face, weighing his sincerity against their long history. Redemption takes more than words, Daniel. More than one action, however risky. I know. His shoulders slumped slightly. I don't expect forgiveness. I wouldn't in your place. I just wanted you to understand why I'm doing this, and to warn you to be careful. Velez's organization is extensive. Margaret nodded, a strange calm settling over her. I appreciate the warning. And the explanation. An awkward silence stretched between them. Finally, Daniel asked hesitantly, how are Ethan and Marianne? The question opened a door Margaret wasn't sure she wanted to walk through. But she couldn't deny him news of his children, not when he seemed genuinely concerned. They're doing as well as can be expected. Ethan's lost 2 teeth. Marianne's learning embroidery. They visit me some weekends while Sophie works. Daniel's eyes widened slightly. Embroidery, both of them. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. Even Ethan. He's quite good, actually. Determined. A shadow of grief crossed Daniel's face. I'm missing everything. Yes, you are, Margaret acknowledged without cruelty. That's the consequence of your choices. He nodded, accepting the truth of her words. Mom, would you tell them I asked about them? That I miss them? Margaret considered his request carefully. She wouldn't lie to the children, but neither would she inflict false hope or unnecessary pain. I'll tell them you're thinking of them. The rest depends on your actions over time, not just your words today. Fair enough, Daniel conceded. As the guard indicated their time was ending, Daniel leaned forward, urgency in his voice. Mom, please be careful. Velez's people are serious. They may come after you to get to me. Margaret stood, gathering her purse. Then they'll discover I'm not as vulnerable as they might expect. Daniel's expression shifted, something like pride flickering briefly in his eyes. No, you're not. You never really were. The words followed Margaret out of the detention center, echoing in her mind as she made her way home. You never really were. Had Daniel seen strength in her that she herself hadn't recognized until recently? Or was this another manipulation, subtle flattery to regain her trust? She couldn't be certain, but for the first time she found she could live with that uncertainty. Daniel's redemption, if genuine, was his own journey. Her focus remained on the life she was building day by day, stitch by stitch. That evening she received a text from Sophie with photos of the children at their school's art show. Marianne holding up a painting of what appeared to be a sunset. Ethan grinning beside a clay sculpture of indeterminate form. The simple domestic moment struck Margaret with unexpected force. This was what mattered now. Not Edward's deceptions, not Daniel's choices, but these 2 young lives still unfolding, still malleable, still capable of breaking generational patterns. She texted back her congratulations, then set her phone aside and picked up her latest embroidery project. A complex design of interlocking patterns that she'd created herself, unlike anything she'd attempted before. As her needle moved through the fabric, pulling thread into new configurations, she reflected on her conversation with Daniel. Redemption takes more than words. She'd said it to him, but the truth applied equally to her own journey. Moving beyond the role of victim required more than physical distance from her oppressors. It demanded active creation of a new identity, new relationships, new patterns of thought and behavior. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Margaret rose early, made tea, and carried it to her small balcony to watch the sunrise. The ocean stretched before her, vast and ever-changing, yet somehow constant. Like herself, she mused. Different every day in small ways, yet fundamentally the same person she'd always been, beneath the layers of subordination and self-doubt. Her peaceful reflection shattered at the sound of her phone ringing. Detective Price's number flashed on the screen. Margaret answered immediately, her pulse quickening. Mrs. Evans, the detective's voice was tense. There's been an incident at the detention center. Your son has been attacked by another inmate. Margaret gripped the phone tightly. How bad? Serious but not life-threatening. He's been transferred to the prison medical ward. Multiple stab wounds, but he's stable. Was it connected to his testimony against Velez? We believe so, the detective confirmed. The inmate who attacked him has known connections to Velez's organization. Mrs. Evans, this escalates our concerns about your safety. We're sending an officer to your apartment now. I'd like you to pack an overnight bag and come to the station until we can arrange more permanent protection. Margaret's mind raced through the implications. If they'd gotten to Daniel inside a detention center, how much easier would it be to reach her? Or worse, Sophie and the children. I understand, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. I'll be ready when the officer arrives. She moved through her apartment with methodical efficiency, packing essentials into a small suitcase. Medications, toiletries, a few changes of clothes. Her embroidery supplies a small comfort in the chaos that had erupted around her. As she worked, a strange calm descended. This was not the first time her life had been upended by men's violence, but it would be the first time she faced such disruption on her own terms with clear eyes and full agency. The doorbell rang. Margaret checked the peephole before opening it, relief washing over her at the sight of a uniformed officer. As she locked her apartment door, she glanced back at the small space she'd made her own. Would she return here, or would this newest development force yet another beginning? The question followed her to the police station, where Detective Price met her with apologetic efficiency. "We're working on arrangements for temporary housing," she explained. "Somewhere secure away from your usual routines, just until we can assess the full extent of the threat." Margaret set her suitcase down. "And what about Sophie and the children already notified? They're staying with a family member whose address isn't linked to Daniel or to you. We've assigned an officer to monitor their location as well." Relief mingled with fresh worry. Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "I never imagined my life at 68 would involve witness protection." Detective Price's expression softened slightly. "It's not quite that dramatic, Mrs. Evans. Just temporary precautions while we neutralize the threat. Velez is in custody and we're rounding up his key associates. This won't be forever." Margaret nodded, trying to believe her. "How is Daniel beyond stable?" The detective hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty was necessary. "He required surgery. The wounds weren't random, they were intended to send a message, not kill. He's conscious and cooperating with the investigation." A message. The word sent a chill through Margaret. She didn't need to ask what the message was. "Betray us and there's nowhere you can hide, not even prison." "Can I see him?" The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise the detective. "Not immediately," Detective Price replied. "He's under heavy guard at the hospital. Once he's transferred back to the detention center, we can arrange a visit if you still want one." Margaret nodded, uncertain whether her impulse to see Daniel sprang from maternal concern or some deeper need to confront the chaos he'd brought into her carefully reconstructed life. For now, she followed Detective Price to a small conference room where she would wait while arrangements were made for her temporary relocation. Left alone with her thoughts, Margaret reached into her bag for the embroidery hoop she'd packed. The familiar motion of needle and thread would steady her as it had through so many crises before. The design she was working on was her most ambitious, yet a seascape in graduated blues and greens with silver thread catching the light like sunlight on water. She'd planned to display it at the next craft fair, perhaps even enter it in the county's senior art competition. Now, as her needle dipped and rose through the taut fabric, she considered the uncertain future stretching before her. Would she be able to attend that fair? Would she return to her apartment, her new friends, the modest life she'd built from the wreckage of the old one, or would Daniel's decisions once again reshape her existence without her consent? No, she decided, pulling a stitch tight with unusual force. Those days were over. Whatever came next, the decisions would be hers. She might have to adapt to circumstances beyond her control, but she would do so consciously, strategically. The days of being a passive recipient of men's choices had ended the moment she'd walked out of her house 6 months ago. Hours later, Detective Price returned with news. They'd arranged temporary housing for Margaret in a secure apartment complex often used for protected witnesses about an hour from Miami. She would have an officer nearby at all times. The arrangement would last at least 2 weeks, possibly longer, depending on the investigation's progress. "I know this is disruptive." The detective acknowledged rare sympathy showing through her professional demeanor. "But it's the safest option right now." Margaret gathered her belongings, resigned to this latest development. "Before we go, I'd like to call Sophie. Let her know I'm all right." The detective nodded, granting her privacy for the call. Sophie answered immediately, her voice tense with worry. "Margaret, thank God. Are you okay?" "They wouldn't tell us much, just that there might be danger because of Daniel's testimony." "I'm fine," Margaret assured her. "Being relocated temporarily as a precaution." "How are the children?" "Confused." "Scared," Sophie admitted. "I told them we're having a special vacation at Uncle Rob's house. Ethan keeps asking questions I can't answer." Margaret's heart ached for her grandchildren once again suffering for their father's actions. "Tell them I'm fine, just taking a little trip, that I'll see them soon." She hesitated, then added, "And Sophie, this won't last forever. We'll get through it just like everything else." After hanging up, Margaret followed Detective Price to a waiting car with tinted windows. As they drove away from the police station, she watched Miami recede in the rear window, the gleaming buildings, the palm-lined streets, the glimpses of turquoise ocean. The city that had become her unexpected haven, now transformed into potential danger. The secure apartment turned out to be a studio in a nondescript building with security cameras and a guard at the entrance. Sparsely furnished but clean, it reminded Margaret of a hotel room, impersonal, transient, a place to pass through rather than inhabit. She unpacked her few belongings, arranging them to create some semblance of normalcy. Her embroidery supplies on the small table, her medications in the bathroom cabinet. The family photo Sophie had given her Margaret with Ethan and Marianne at the beach, placed on the nightstand where she could see it from the bed. An officer would remain in the hallway outside her door at all times, Detective Price explained. Another would patrol the building's perimeter. Margaret was advised not to leave without escort, to keep her blinds closed, to use her phone only for essential communications. "I feel like I'm in a movie," Margaret observed dryly as the detective prepared to leave. "A bad one." Detective Price's expression remained serious. "It's just temporary, Mrs. Evans. We're making significant progress against Velez's organization. Several key associates were arrested this morning based on information from your son." The implication was clear. Daniel's cooperation continued despite the attack, his testimony becoming more valuable, not less. Margaret wasn't sure whether to feel proud or terrified by her son's apparent courage. Left alone in the sterile apartment, she surveyed her new temporary home. The walls were beige, the furniture utilitarian, the silence oppressive after the constant background noise of ocean waves at her own place. She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the surreal turn of events. 6 months ago, she'd fled her house with one suitcase, determined to escape Daniel's manipulation and build a life on her own terms. Now here she was, once again displaced, once again with just a suitcase of belongings. The parallel might have seemed like failure, if not for one crucial difference. This time she wasn't running away from something, but protecting what she'd built. Her independence, her dignity, her future. The thought straightened her spine. She reached for her embroidery hoop, determined to use even this strange interlude productively. Her needle pierced the fabric, drawing blue thread through in a practiced rhythm. Stitch by stitch, day by day, she would continue crafting her life, regardless of circumstances. Not even Velez and his criminal associates could take that from her. 3 days passed in monotonous confinement. Margaret established new routines, morning stretches embroidery for hours at a stretch, brief walks around the building's interior courtyard with her police escort. Detective Price called daily with updates, each one. Similar investigation preceding arrests, continuing threat assessment, ongoing. On the 4th day, the pattern broke. The detective arrived in person, her expression grave yet somehow lighter than before. "We've arrested the last of Velez's inner circle," she announced. "Based on our intelligence, the immediate threat to you has significantly decreased." Margaret set down her embroidery. "Does that mean I can go home?" Soon the detective nodded. "We'd like to maintain precautions for another day or two while we process the new detainees. But yes, you should be able to return to your apartment by the weekend." Relief washed over Margaret, tempered by a lingering question. "And Daniel, how is he recovering? Well?" Detective Price's expression softened slightly. "He's been extraordinarily cooperative, Mrs. Evans. His testimony has been crucial to dismantling Velez's operation. The prosecutor is considering further reductions to his sentence in light of the risks he's taken and the value of his information." Margaret absorbed this news with complicated emotions. Part of her, the mother who remembered Daniel as a bright, determined child, felt a flicker of pride. Another part, the woman who'd been manipulated and betrayed, remained wary of assuming too much change. "When can I see him?" she asked, the question emerging before she'd fully decided to ask it. "He's still in the prison medical ward, but should be cleared to receive visitors in a few days. I can arrange it if you're sure." Margaret nodded slowly. "I'm sure." After the detective left, Margaret returned to her embroidery, the complex seascape now nearly complete. As her needle moved through the fabric, her thoughts circled around Daniel. His attack, his continued testimony despite the danger, his apparent efforts toward redemption, however limited by his circumstances. Could people truly change? Margaret wasn't naive enough to expect dramatic transformation, but perhaps change came in smaller increments. A decision to cooperate rather than obstruct, to protect rather than endanger, to acknowledge responsibility rather than deflect it. She thought of her own journey over the past 6 months. The woman who'd walked away from her house that day wasn't the same one sitting here now, creating beauty with needle and thread, building new relationships, discovering strengths long dormant. Change was possible. She was living proof. Whether Daniel's changes were genuine or strategic remained to be seen. But for the first time, Margaret found herself open to the possibility that her son might find his way back to the person he could have been before Edward's toxic influence and his own worst choices had diverted his path. 3 days later, Margaret stood outside the hospital room where Daniel was recovering, oddly hesitant now that the moment had arrived. Detective Price waited respectfully at a distance, allowing her privacy for this reunion. Taking a deep breath, Margaret pushed open the door. Daniel lay in a hospital bed, thinner than before, his complexion pale against the white sheets. Bandages were visible beneath his hospital gown. His eyes, when they found her, widened with surprise and something like hope. "Mom." "You came." Margaret moved to the chair beside his bed, setting down the small bag she'd brought. "I said I would." An awkward silence settled between them, heavy with shared history and uncertain future. Margaret broke it first, gesturing to his bandaged torso. "How are you feeling? Like I've been stabbed?" Daniel attempted a weak smile. "But better than I was. They're moving me back to the detention center tomorrow." "I heard you've continued to cooperate," Margaret said carefully, "despite the risks." He nodded, his expression turning serious. It seemed like the right thing to do, maybe the only thing at this point. Margaret studied him, searching for the manipulative son she'd known finding. Instead, a man who looked strangely vulnerable, stripped of his usual armor of charm and deflection. "I brought you something," she said, finally reaching into her bag. "It's not much." She handed him a small embroidered handkerchief. In the corner, in neat blue stitches, she'd created a simple wave pattern surrounding his initials. Daniel took it carefully, as if it might disintegrate in his hands. "You made this for me." Margaret nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Embroidery has become important to me. A way to create something new from loose threads and blank fabric." He traced the pattern with his finger, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Like building a life from scratch." "Something like that," she acknowledged. Another silence fell, but different now, contemplative rather than strained. Finally, Daniel spoke again, his voice low and hesitant. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But could you tell me about them? Ethan and Marianne, what they're like now?" Margaret considered her answer carefully. This wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But it was about the children who deserved to be known and remembered by their father, however flawed. She began to speak, describing Ethan's boundless energy, his newfound interest in embroidery, his collection of shells arranged carefully on his windowsill at Sophie's apartment. She told Daniel about Marianne's quiet determination, her artistic talent, her tendency to observe everything before committing herself to action. As she spoke, she watched Daniel's face, the pain and longing evident, as he absorbed these details of the children growing up without him. For the first time, Margaret saw him experiencing the genuine consequences of his choices, not with self-pity or deflection, but with clear-eyed acceptance. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment. Then softly, "Thank you for telling me, for seeing them, for being there when I can't." Margaret nodded, unsure what to say. The raw honesty of the moment had stripped away their usual defenses, leaving only the complicated truth of their relationship, mother and son, each damaged by Edward in different ways, each finding their own path toward healing. "I should go," she said eventually, gathering her bag. "The officer is waiting." Daniel reached out hesitantly, not quite touching her hand. "Will you come again sometime?" Margaret paused at the door, considering. "Perhaps, if you continue on this path." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was an acknowledgement of possibility, that redemption, however difficult and distant, might not be entirely beyond reach. As she left the hospital with her police escort, Margaret's phone chimed with a text from Sophie. "Got the all clear to go home. Kids can't wait to see you next weekend." Margaret smiled the simple message, reorienting her toward the future. Whatever happened with Daniel, whether his apparent change proved lasting or fleeting, her own journey continued. Her relationship with her grandchildren, her growing business, her new friends, the life she was building stitch by stitch, day by day. By the time she returned to her apartment the following afternoon, a decision had crystallized in her mind. She wouldn't allow fear of Velez's associates, of Daniel's potential manipulation of an uncertain future, to dictate her choices. She would live fully cautiously, but not fearfully, making each day a conscious creation, rather than a reaction to circumstances. She unpacked her suitcase, returned her embroidery supplies to their proper place, and opened the blinds to let in the late afternoon sunlight. The ocean gleamed in the distance, constant yet ever-changing, like herself, like life itself. Margaret Evans stood at her balcony, 68 years old, alone but not lonely, separate from her past but not defined by it. She had survived Edward's control, Daniel's betrayal, and now Velez's threats. More than survived, she had emerged stronger, clearer, more fully herself than she had ever been allowed to be. The future stretched before her, a blank fabric awaiting her needle, her thread, her design. And for the first time in her long life, Margaret faced that future not with fear or resignation, but with quiet, unshakable certainty that whatever pattern emerged would be entirely her own.